Preston Waverly didn't just humiliate a woman at Atlanta's most exclusive charity gala, he shoved her into an infinity pool while cameras rolled and the city's elite watched in frozen horror. What the billionaire real estate king didn't know: the elegant black attorney he just assaulted was married to the one man holding his crumbling empire together. One contract, one handshake, one deal standing between Preston and total financial collapse. And in 30 seconds of rage-fueled arrogance, he destroyed it all. This is the story of how power met consequences, how dignity became a weapon, and how one push changed everything. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The Waverly Tower cast its shadow across Peachtree Street like a monument to everything Preston Waverly believed he owned: the skyline, the politicians, the future itself. 23 floors of steel and glass that reflected nothing but his own carefully constructed image back at him. Inside the penthouse office, Preston stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching Atlanta spread beneath him like a kingdom, and smiled the smile of a man who'd never heard the word no in any language that mattered. "Sir, the Carter proposal just came through." Preston didn't turn. His assistant, Evelyn Marsh, had worked for him long enough to know that immediate responses were for people who worried about other people's time. She stood near his desk, tablet in hand, gray suit impeccable, expression professionally neutral in the way that came from years of watching powerful men mistake cruelty for strength. "And?" Preston finally asked, still gazing out at his city. Malcolm Carter's AI platform exceeded every benchmark. "The predictive modeling is, sir, it's extraordinary." The demonstration showed consistent accuracy rates above 92% for market trend forecasting. His team is ready to finalize terms. Now Preston turned. At 58, he'd maintained the sharp-featured handsomeness that came from excellent genes, better personal trainers, and the kind of confidence that money couldn't buy but could certainly reinforce. His silver-threaded dark hair was cut with precision. His suit cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Everything about Preston Waverly was designed to remind you that he operated on a different level than ordinary humans. "Malcolm Carter," Preston said, tasting the name like expensive wine that didn't quite meet his standards. "The tech wonder kid. Stanford MBA, 40 under 40, all that diversity magazine cover nonsense." "He's built 3 successful companies," Evelyn said quietly. "This AI platform could revolutionize how your investment division operates, especially given the current challenges with the commercial real estate portfolio." Preston's jaw tightened. The challenges were more like hemorrhaging wounds, but he'd be damned if he'd let his assistant see him flinch. 6 major properties bleeding value, creditors who'd gone from friendly to persistent, a board of directors who'd started asking uncomfortable questions about leverage ratios and risk exposure. Preston had built his empire on reading markets, on knowing when to push and when to pivot, but the world had shifted beneath his feet. Remote work had gutted office building values. Rising interest rates had turned his debt from manageable to crushing. And the sharks were circling. Malcolm Carter's AI platform wasn't just an opportunity, it was oxygen. "Set the meeting," Preston said, "but make sure he understands who's doing whom the favor here." Evelyn's fingers moved across her tablet. "Of course, sir. Also, the Nexus Foundation Gala is Saturday evening. Your RSVP has been confirmed." Preston nodded dismissively. The Nexus Foundation Gala was the social event of the Atlanta season, $2,000 a plate, held on the rooftop of the Azure Hotel with its famous infinity pool and panoramic views. It was where deals got made over champagne, where political futures were quietly decided, where Atlanta's power structure came together to congratulate itself on its own magnificence while pretending to care about whichever cause was fashionable that year. This year's theme was educational equity. Preston would write a check, shake some hands, and remind everyone in the room why they needed to stay in his good graces. He'd done it 100 times before. What Preston didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he stood in his tower watching the sun sink over Atlanta, was that Saturday night would be the last time anyone in that room would ever look at him the same way again. 3 days before the gala, Malcolm Carter sat in his own office 15 blocks away, reviewing the Waverly Tower proposal with the kind of careful attention that had made him successful before he turned 35. Where Preston's office was all aggressive angles and intimidating views, Malcolm's workspace reflected a different philosophy. The top floor of Carter Technologies was designed for collaboration: glass walls, open sightlines, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than confrontation. His corner office had a door he rarely closed. "You're really going to do business with Preston Waverly?" Malcolm looked up to find his wife leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in the expression that always meant she'd already formed an opinion and was giving him exactly one chance to catch up. Nia Carter was the kind of beautiful that made people look twice, not because of any single feature, but because of the way she carried herself, the intelligence that sparked in her dark eyes, the presence that filled whatever room she entered. At 33, she'd already made partner at Morrison & Chase, one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms. She'd built her reputation defending civil rights cases that other attorneys considered too risky or too complicated. She wore a navy suit that was professional without being severe, her natural hair styled in elegant twists that framed her face perfectly. Malcolm smiled despite himself. "Hello to you too, love." "Don't love me. Preston Waverly is a snake. Everyone knows it. He's a businessman with deep pockets and excellent connections. He's a racist with a veneer of respectability." Nia walked into the office, closing the door behind her. "Remember the Thompson case? He fired 3 black executives in 18 months, fought every discrimination claim with armies of lawyers, and settled everything with NDAs and silence. That's his pattern: exploit, extract, erase." Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "You're not wrong about his history, but this isn't about friendship. It's business. His company needs our AI platform. We need access to his investment network and client base. It's mutually beneficial." Nothing with Preston Waverly is mutual. He doesn't do partnerships, he does acquisitions. And the moment he thinks you're vulnerable, he'll gut you and sell the pieces. Then we make sure we're never vulnerable. Nia studied her husband with the same intense focus she brought to cross-examination. Malcolm was brilliant. She'd never doubted that. He'd built Carter Technologies from a startup in a shared workspace to a $100 million company with offices in 3 cities. But brilliance could sometimes blind you to the things that weren't on spreadsheets or in business plans. Things like pride, prejudice, and the particular brand of cruelty that came from men who'd never been told they couldn't have something they wanted. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she finally said. "Men like Preston don't lose gracefully." Malcolm stood and walked around his desk, pulling his wife close. "I promise. Besides, you'll be with me at the gala Saturday. If anything feels wrong, we'll walk away." Nia relaxed into his embrace, but the unease didn't quite leave her chest. "The Nexus Foundation event? You know I hate those things." "I know, but it's important. Half the tech investment community will be there. Good opportunity to network, maybe line up our next round of funding." "Fine, but you owe me a real date afterward, somewhere without a single person trying to pitch you a blockchain solution." Malcolm laughed, kissing her forehead. "Deal." What neither of them knew, what they couldn't have known, was that careful wouldn't be nearly enough. Preston Waverly didn't think of himself as a racist. He thought of himself as a realist. In the private moments when he was honest with himself, which weren't frequent, he understood that the distinction was thinner than paper, but he'd spent decades building justifications that let him sleep comfortably on 1,000 thread count sheets. The truth was simpler and uglier than Preston would ever admit. He hated that he needed Malcolm Carter, hated that this young black entrepreneur had built something Preston's entire team of Ivy League analysts couldn't replicate, hated that Malcolm held leverage in a negotiation Preston was accustomed to dominating, hated, most of all, that everyone in their overlapping circles would see Preston Waverly, real estate king, political kingmaker, master of the universe, asking a younger black man for help. It ate at him. Saturday arrived with perfect Georgia weather. Clear skies, temperature dropping into a comfortable evening warmth, the kind of night that made Atlanta feel like the center of everything important. The Azure Hotel's rooftop had been transformed into an elegant fantasy. String lights crossed the open sky. The infinity pool glowed with underwater illumination that made it seem to drop off into the city lights beyond. 100-year-old olive trees and massive planters created intimate spaces. A 12-piece orchestra played just loud enough to set the mood without overwhelming conversation. Preston arrived fashionably late, making his entrance in a tuxedo that had been custom-tailored in London. He moved through the crowd like a shark through schools of fish, always in motion, always positioning, always calculating. Within 15 minutes, he'd worked his way to the center of power, Judge Harrison Blackwell, who controlled courtrooms and decisions, Senator Patricia Drummond, who controlled committees and legislation, and David Chen, president of Meridian Capital Bank, who controlled money and access. This was Preston's inner circle. The people who mattered, the people who made things happen. Preston, Senator Drummond air-kissed near his cheek. Darling, you look absolutely predatory tonight. I'll take that as the compliment you intended, Preston replied smoothly. Judge Senator David, lovely to see Atlanta's finest all in one place. We were just discussing the Carter Technologies deal, Judge Blackwell said, swirling his bourbon. Quite a reversal for you, isn't it? Usually you're the one everyone comes begging to. Preston's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Strategic partnership, his technology, my infrastructure. Standard collaboration. Of course, David Chen said, but his tone suggested he knew better. Though I hear his platform could save your commercial portfolio from complete disaster, timing works out nicely for you. Preston hated David in that moment, hated the smirk barely hidden behind professional courtesy, hated that everyone at this table knew he was bleeding. But he'd learned long ago that showing weakness to people like this was suicide, so he laughed like he was in on the joke. The market's correcting. Anyone with sense is repositioning. Carter's AI helps us move faster, that's all. Sure it is, Senator Drummond said, flagging down a server for more champagne. And I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact that Stellar Properties is about to default on 3 loans and your board is threatening mutiny. Preston's jaw tightened. Where did you hear that? I'm a senator, darling. I hear everything. She accepted a fresh glass and fixed Preston with a look that was pure calculation. The question is, what are you willing to do to fix it? Whatever's necessary, Preston said flatly. I always do. That's when he saw them. Malcolm and Nia Carter had just arrived, standing near the entrance while a photographer captured them for the event coverage. Malcolm looked comfortable in his tuxedo, the easy confidence of someone who'd earned his place rather than inherited it. But it was Nia who made Preston's blood pressure spike. She wore a midnight blue gown that was elegant without being flashy, her shoulders bare, her natural hair styled in a way that was both professional and effortlessly beautiful. She was laughing at something Malcolm had said, her hand resting on his arm, completely at ease in a room full of Atlanta's elite. Preston stared, not with admiration, with something darker. She represented everything that made him uncomfortable in the new Atlanta, the changing Atlanta. The Atlanta that was slipping away from people who looked and thought like him. She was young, successful, beautiful, confident, black, and completely unintimidated by rooms like this. She existed in his world not as a servant or a token, but as an equal, maybe even a superior, and that reality made something violent twist in Preston's chest. That's Carter's wife, Judge Blackwell said, following Preston's gaze. Attorney, civil rights specialist, won that housing discrimination case against Pemberton last year. I remember, Senator Drummond added, absolutely demolished them in court, cost them $15 million in settlements, and made them restructure their entire rental policy. Impressive woman. She's trouble, Preston said quietly. That kind always is. What kind? David Chen asked, his voice carefully neutral. Preston realized he'd said too much but was too angry to care. The kind who doesn't know her place, who thinks a law degree and a rich husband mean she belongs in rooms like this. The table went quiet. Even Preston's inner circle, people who'd tolerated and sometimes encouraged his worst impulses, recognized that he'd crossed a line. Senator Drummond looked uncomfortable. Judge Blackwell studied his bourbon like it held answers. David Chen's expression went carefully blank. Preston, the judge said slowly, maybe you should... I'm fine, Preston snapped. He wasn't fine. He was furious in a way that felt electric and dangerous, the kind of anger that came from fear he'd never acknowledge. He grabbed a fresh whiskey from a passing server and drained half of it in one swallow. Across the rooftop, completely unaware of the venom being directed her way, Nia Carter was having a much better evening. She'd spotted 3 former classmates from law school, reconnected with a colleague from Morrison and Chase, and was now engaged in an animated discussion about Supreme Court precedent with a visiting professor from Emory. Malcolm had been absorbed into a circle of tech investors, leaving Nia free to navigate the gala on her own terms. She excused herself from the legal discussion and stepped out onto the terrace for some air. The infinity pool stretched before her, the water's edge seeming to blend directly into the Atlanta skyline beyond. String lights reflected on the water's surface. Music drifted from inside. For a moment, Nia allowed herself to appreciate the beauty of it all, while maintaining the emotional distance that came from knowing exactly how much inequality funded nights like this. Quite a view, isn't it? Nia turned to find Senator Drummond approaching with a fresh champagne glass in hand. They'd met before at various political fundraisers. The senator was in her early 60s, with the kind of polished appearance that came from decades in public life. Every hair in place, every gesture calculated, every word tested for maximum impact. "Senator," Nia said warmly, "good to see you again." "You too, dear. I was just telling Judge Blackwell about your work on the Pemberton case. Absolutely brilliant litigation." "Thank you. It was a team effort, but we're pleased with the outcome." They talked for a few minutes about housing policy and legal reform, the kind of conversation that was substantive enough to feel meaningful, but surface enough to remain comfortable. Nia was just starting to relax when she noticed them approaching. Preston Waverly walked onto the terrace flanked by Judge Blackwell and David Chen, moving with the kind of purpose that made Nia's attorney instincts flare with warning. She'd seen that look before. In depositions, in courtrooms, in conference rooms where powerful men who weren't used to losing decided to make their displeasure everyone else's problem. "Mrs. Carter," Preston said, his voice carrying a false warmth that fooled no one. "I was hoping to introduce myself. Preston Waverly." Nia extended her hand professionally. "Mr. Waverly, I know who you are. My husband speaks highly of your business acumen." Preston's handshake was too firm, held too long, designed to establish dominance. Nia didn't flinch or pull away, just maintained eye contact and waited him out. When he finally released her hand, something ugly flickered across his face. "Your husband and I are finalizing a rather significant partnership," Preston said. "His technology, my resources, should be quite profitable for everyone involved. I'm sure Malcolm will navigate it skillfully. He usually does." "Of course. Though I have to wonder if he fully understands the landscape he's entering. Atlanta's business community has certain expectations, certain ways of doing things." The words themselves were neutral, but the tone wasn't. Nia felt the temperature shift as Senator Drummond and the others tensed. This wasn't a friendly introduction. This was a power play, but she couldn't quite see the shape of it yet. "Malcolm understands business very well," Nia said evenly. "That's why he's built 3 successful companies before turning 35. "Impressive," Preston agreed, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Especially for someone from his background. Not everyone can bridge that gap so effectively." There it was, the first explicit cut. Nia felt anger flash through her chest, but kept her face professionally pleasant. She'd dealt with men like Preston her entire career, men who'd never say the quiet part loud, but who made sure you heard it anyway. His background of Stanford education, entrepreneurial success, and innovative thinking? Yes, I'd say that background serves him well. Preston's smile sharpened. "That's not quite what I meant." "Then perhaps you should clarify." The terrace had gone quiet. Other guests had noticed the exchange, the tension, the way Preston's circle had formed a subtle wall between Nia and the rest of the party. Senator Drummond looked like she wanted to intervene, but couldn't find the right entry point. Judge Blackwell studied his drink. David Chen had gone very still. "I just think it's important that people understand their position," Preston said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, more threatening. "In business, in society, in rooms like this, some people are born to lead, others aren't. And no amount of education or money changes fundamental realities." Nia's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "What fundamental realities would those be, Mr. Waverly?" Preston stepped closer. Nia held her ground. "That success requires more than just intelligence. It requires breeding, heritage, the kind of background that can't be bought or faked. You and your husband might wear the right clothes and say the right things, but you'll never truly belong in this world. You'll always be careful. Nia's voice cut like a blade. Choose your next words very carefully, Mr. Waverly. Preston's eyes flashed with something dark and reckless. The whiskey had removed his usual filters, the anger had burned through his common sense, and the fear that had been eating at him for months finally found a target. I'll choose whatever words I please. This is my city, my circle, my world. And I don't appreciate people like you coming in here acting like you own the place when everyone knows exactly what you are. And what am I? Nia asked quietly, dangerously. Preston opened his mouth to respond, and that's when Malcolm appeared. He'd been networking inside when someone had pulled him aside and mentioned that his wife was on the terrace with Preston Waverly, and things looked tense. Malcolm had excused himself immediately and pushed through the crowd with growing alarm. Now he stood at the terrace entrance, taking in the scene. Nia isolated near the pool, Preston too close to her, a circle of Preston's allies forming a wall, and the barely suppressed violence in the air. Nia? Malcolm called out, moving toward her. Preston turned, and his expression transformed into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so full of hate. Ah, there he is. We were just getting to know your lovely wife, Carter. Beautiful woman, quite opinionated. Malcolm positioned himself next to Nia, his body language protective but controlled. Is everything all right? Fine, Nia said, though her jaw was tight. Mr. Waverly was just sharing his thoughts on who belongs in rooms like this. Malcolm's expression hardened. He'd built his company by reading people, by understanding the currents beneath surface interactions, and he could see exactly what had happened here, could see the rage in Preston's eyes, the discomfort in the circle around them, the way other guests had started to notice and gather. I think perhaps, Malcolm started. I think perhaps nothing, Preston interrupted, his voice rising. I think perhaps it's time someone said what everyone in this room is thinking. You people come in here with your degrees and your companies and your lawsuits thinking you can just take over, thinking you deserve the same respect as people who built this city. But you don't. You never will. You people, Nia repeated, her voice like steel. Say what you mean, Preston. The crowd had grown now. Phones were out, first a few, then more, the way it always happened when something was going wrong in public. People sensing a moment, a story, a spectacle. Preston's inner circle was frantically trying to signal him to stop, to walk away, but he was too far gone now. Too angry, too drunk, too desperate to prove something that couldn't be proven. You want me to say it? Preston snarled. Fine. You're just another affirmative action hire who married a tech entrepreneur and thinks that makes you special. You're not special. You're not impressive. You're just another... What happened next occurred so quickly that later witnesses would argue about the exact sequence. Preston lunged forward, not to hit Nia, but to grab her arm, to physically move her, to assert dominance the way he'd asserted dominance his entire life. Nia stepped back. Her heel caught on the pool's edge. She lost her balance, arms windmilling. Malcolm reached for her, but was a second too slow. And Preston, drunk, enraged, and finally past the point of calculation, did the unthinkable. He shoved her. The push itself wasn't violent in the way of a punch or a slap, but the intent was unmistakable. The cruelty was absolute. Nia's eyes went wide with shock as she fell backward, her midnight blue gown billowing, her arms reaching for anything, finding nothing. She hit the infinity pool with a splash that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. The entire terrace froze like someone had pressed pause on reality. The orchestra stopped mid-note. Conversations died mid-word. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Then the phones, dozens of them now, maybe 100, all captured the same image. Nia Carter surfacing in the pool, soaked and shaking, her elegant gown ruined, her hair plastered to her face, her expression cycling through shock and humiliation, and finally settling on something that looked like devastating clarity. Preston stood at the pool's edge, his chest heaving, his face flushed, his brain finally starting to catch up to what his body had just done. He looked down at Nia, looked up at the crowd, looked at the phones, looked at Malcolm. Malcolm's face had gone absolutely empty. Not angry. Anger would have been better. This was something colder and far more terrifying. The look of a man making calculations, running scenarios, deciding exactly how to destroy someone with maximum efficiency. Malcolm, Preston started, his voice suddenly desperate, suddenly aware of the magnitude of his mistake. It was an accident. I didn't mean, get away from my wife. Malcolm's voice was quiet but carried across the silent terrace like a gunshot. Listen, we can talk about this. The partnership, the deal, we can work this out. Get away from my wife. Preston stumbled backward as Malcolm moved to the pool's edge, kneeling down and extending his hand to Naya. She took it, allowing him to help her out of the water. She was shaking, from cold, from shock, from rage, from the absolute violation of being assaulted in front of hundreds of people by a man who thought he could get away with it because he always had. Malcolm wrapped his tuxedo jacket around her shoulders, holding her close, murmuring softly in her ear. She nodded against his chest, water dripping from her hair onto the designer tile. Security finally arrived, pushing through the crowd. The Azure Hotel's events manager was pale with horror, already trying to calculate the liability, the lawsuit, the absolute catastrophe this had become. Senator Drummond had her phone out, presumably calling someone who could contain the damage. Judge Blackwell had disappeared entirely. David Chen stood frozen, watching his business relationship with Preston Waverly evaporate in real time. "Mr. Waverly," one of the security guards said, "we need you to come with us." Preston looked at the guard with the kind of indignant fury that came from a lifetime of being untouchable. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes, sir. That's why we're asking you to come quietly." Preston turned back to Malcolm, his desperation now complete. "Carter, please. This is a misunderstanding. Business doesn't have to—" Malcolm looked up from where he was holding his wife, and Preston stopped talking. The expression on Malcolm's face would haunt Preston for the rest of his considerably shorter career. "There is no business," Malcolm said, his voice carrying across the terrace with absolute finality. "There is no partnership. There is no deal. There is no relationship of any kind between you and me or my company. As of this moment, you are nothing to me. You can't— The contract. We had an agreement. We had a preliminary discussion. No contracts have been signed. My attorneys will confirm that fact in writing Monday morning." Malcolm's eyes were chips of ice. "You just destroyed the only thing keeping your company alive, Preston, and you did it in front of every phone on this rooftop." The words landed like physical blows. Preston's face went from flush to pale as the reality crashed over him. The AI platform that was supposed to save his commercial portfolio, gone. The strategic partnership that would have given him a lifeline, gone. The deal that his board and his creditors and his investors were counting on, gone. All of it gone in the 30 seconds it took to assault a woman who'd done nothing except refuse to accept his ugliness. "Please," Preston whispered, and the word came out broken. "Please, you don't understand what this means." "I understand exactly what it means," Malcolm said. "It means you'll have to face consequences for once in your privileged life. It means your hate finally cost you something you can't afford to lose. It means you pushed my wife into a pool and expected to walk away like nothing happened." His voice dropped even lower, but somehow became more powerful. "It means you're finished." Security was moving Preston toward the exit now, one guard on each arm. The crowd parted silently, phones still recording, still capturing every moment of Preston Waverly's spectacular self-destruction. He tried to salvage something, anything, but the words died in his throat. What could he say that would undo what hundreds of people had witnessed and thousands would see before morning? As Preston was led inside, Malcolm turned his full attention back to Nia. She was still shaking, but her eyes were dry and her jaw was set. She'd learned long ago that some situations required tears later in private, where your grief and rage wouldn't become entertainment for people who couldn't understand them. "Are you hurt?" Malcolm asked softly. "No, just cold and furious." She looked up at him, her dark eyes blazing. "He thought he could do that to me. Thought he could humiliate me in front of everyone, and I'd just accept it. Because of who he is. Because of who we are. He was wrong. They're all wrong, every single one of them who thinks power means immunity. Nia's voice was gaining strength, her attorney mind already cataloging evidence, witnesses, angles of attack. He just made the biggest mistake of his life, Malcolm. He made several, Malcolm agreed grimly, and we're going to make sure he pays for all of them. The Azure Hotel manager appeared with towels, apologies spilling from his mouth like water from the pool. The Nexus Foundation director was right behind him, horrified and sympathetic, and already trying to figure out how to salvage the evening. Other guests were approaching, some with genuine concern, others with the kind of curious sympathy that came from people who sensed scandal and wanted a closer look. Malcolm waved them all off. "We're leaving. Someone will be in touch about our statement." He guided Nia toward the exit, keeping his body between her and the lingering crowd. As they walked through the rooftop venue, the orchestra started playing again, a desperate attempt at normalcy that felt grotesque given what had just happened. People whispered and stared. Phones tracked their progress. Somewhere, probably everywhere, the video was already starting to spread. In the elevator down, Nia finally let herself lean against her husband. "This is going to be everywhere by morning." "I know." "Preston's going to try to spin it, paint himself as the victim somehow. Say I provoked him or you set him up." "Let him try," Malcolm said flatly. "There are at least 100 videos showing exactly what happened. Showing him corner you, threaten you, assault you. Showing me defend my wife and terminate a business relationship with a man who proved himself to be everything you warned me he was." Nia was quiet for a moment, then, "You really killed the deal." Without hesitation, without regret. Malcolm looked down at her, his expression fierce and tender at the same time. "You are worth more than every contract, every partnership, every dollar I could ever make. Always. And any man who doesn't understand that doesn't deserve to exist in my world." The elevator doors opened to the lobby. They could hear the commotion upstairs already starting to filter down. Voices raised, staff rushing around, the hotel's infrastructure shifting to crisis mode. Malcolm's driver was waiting at the curb with the car running. They climbed in and pulled away from the Azure Hotel as the first news vans were arriving, drawn by the social media frenzy already building. In the back seat, wrapped in Malcolm's jacket with Atlanta sliding past the windows, Nia Carter allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of trembling reaction before her training reasserted itself. She was a civil rights attorney. She'd spent years fighting men like Preston Waverly. She knew exactly how this worked. The assault, the humiliation, the expectation that she'd quietly go away because fighting back was too expensive, too exhausting, too dangerous. But Preston had miscalculated on a fundamental level. Nia wasn't just another woman he could abuse and buy off. She had resources. She had a husband who would burn bridges to protect her. She had a law degree and a decade of experience turning trauma into accountability. Most importantly, she had something Preston couldn't buy and couldn't fight. She was right. And being right, when you had the will and the means to fight, was the most dangerous thing in the world to men who'd spent their lives being wrong with impunity. "Malcolm," Nia said quietly as they drove through the Atlanta night. "Yes?" "Tomorrow morning, I'm calling my senior partners. Then I'm calling every civil rights attorney I know. Then I'm making some calls to people who've been waiting years for the right case to take Preston Waverly apart in court." She turned to look at her husband, and her eyes held something that looked like war. He wanted to show everyone who belonged in that room and who didn't. So let's show him what happens when you push the wrong person. Malcolm took her hand, still damp from the pool, and squeezed it gently. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes, I'm with you." "Good. Because this isn't just about us anymore. This is about every person Preston Waverly ever pushed around, every employee he fired for being the wrong color, every business partner he crushed for being the wrong gender, every person who ever stood in a room and felt his hate disguised as business." Nia's voice was steady now, her purpose crystallizing. "He pushed me into a pool. I'm going to push his entire empire into the ocean." The car turned onto their street. Lights were on in houses where families were settling in for the night, completely unaware that a few miles away at a charity gala, the social order had just shifted beneath everyone's feet. Nia leaned against Malcolm's shoulder, exhausted and energized at the same time, her mind already working through the logistics of what was coming. Because what was coming wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a reckoning. And Preston Waverly, sitting in his Waverly Tower office where security had deposited him after removing him from the Azure Hotel, staring at his phone as the notifications multiplied, and the videos spread and the full magnitude of his catastrophic mistake became undeniable. Preston Waverly was about to discover that some people, when you push them, push back so hard that everything you ever built comes crashing down around you. The battle lines had been drawn at an infinity pool on a perfect Atlanta evening, and the war that was coming would make sure that everyone understood exactly what happened when dignity met power, and power discovered it had finally met something it couldn't overcome. Consequences. By Sunday morning, Preston Waverly's world had already begun its spectacular collapse, though he was still clinging to the delusion that money and connections could contain the damage. He sat in his home office, a cathedral of mahogany and leather that usually made him feel invincible, scrolling through an endless feed of his own destruction. The video had been shared 63,000 times in the first 12 hours. Every major news outlet in Georgia had picked it up. CNN was running it on loop with legal analysts dissecting the assault frame by frame. His phone had been vibrating nonstop since 3 in the morning. Calls from board members, investors, attorneys, and people he'd considered friends, all carrying the same basic message. What the hell were you thinking? Preston hadn't slept. He'd spent the night drinking scotch and drafting statements that his crisis management team, hastily assembled at 2 in the morning, kept rejecting as legally catastrophic. Every version he wrote somehow made things worse. The truth was simple and indefensible. He'd assaulted a woman at a charity gala because she refused to accept his racism, and he'd done it in front of cameras that never stopped recording. Mr. Waverly? His attorney, Richard Morehouse, stood in the doorway looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Richard was 62, a partner at one of Atlanta's white shoe firms, and he'd spent 3 decades helping powerful men escape consequences. But even he looked shaken. We need to talk about realistic options here. Options? Preston laughed bitterly. The only option is damage control. Issue a statement, make a donation to some racial justice charity, let this blow over like everything else blows over. Richard walked into the office and closed the door behind him. Preston, listen to me very carefully. This is not going to blow over. You assaulted an attorney on camera, not just any attorney, a civil rights specialist who's made her career destroying people exactly like you. Her husband just killed a deal worth potentially hundreds of millions to your company. Your board is in emergency session right now deciding whether to force you out. 3 of your biggest investors called me directly to ask if you've lost your mind. They'll calm down once they won't calm down, because this morning, Nia Carter's law firm released a statement. Richard pulled out his tablet and read from the screen. Morrison & Chase is launching a comprehensive investigation into Preston Waverly's business practices with specific focus on patterns of discrimination, retaliation, and hostile work environment claims. They're encouraging anyone who's experienced similar treatment to contact them directly. He looked up. That's not damage control language, Preston. That's a declaration of war. Preston's hand tightened on his glass. She can't prove anything. Every settlement had an NDA. Every termination was documented as performance-based. Your legal team made sure the paperwork looked clean, but Morrison & Chase specializes in finding what's underneath the paperwork, and now they have a very personal reason to look. Richard set down the tablet. I got a call an hour ago from Evelyn Marsh. Preston froze. My assistant? Former assistant. She resigned this morning via email. No notice, no explanation, just gone. Richard's expression was grim. Preston, how much does Evelyn know? How many conversations did she hear? How many emails did she see? The color drained from Preston's face. Evelyn had worked for him for 8 years. She'd been in every meeting, seen every email, heard every phone call. She knew where every body was buried because she'd helped dig half the graves. He'd trusted her because she'd always been so professionally neutral, so reliably discreet. It had never occurred to him that discretion and loyalty weren't the same thing. She signed an NDA, Preston said, but his voice had lost its certainty. NDAs don't cover illegal activity. If she witnessed discrimination, harassment, fraud, anything that violates employment law, she can testify without penalty. Richard leaned forward. What did you say in front of her, Preston? What did you do that she saw? Preston's mind raced through 8 years of casual cruelty, racist jokes, discriminatory directives delivered like they were perfectly reasonable business decisions. How many times had he told Evelyn to find a reason to terminate someone who didn't fit his preferred demographic? How many times had he made comments about employees' race, gender, appearance? How many times had he assumed her silence meant agreement instead of what it actually was, professional survival? I need to talk to her, Preston said, reaching for his phone. You absolutely will not talk to her. Richard's voice cracked like a whip. Any contact could be construed as witness intimidation. You're already facing assault charges. Don't add obstruction to the list. Assault charges? Preston's head snapped up. I pushed her. She's not even hurt. You battered a woman in public. The fact that she wasn't seriously injured doesn't make it legal. Richard pulled up another document on his tablet. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office released a statement 20 minutes ago. They're reviewing the incident for potential criminal charges. Even if they don't prosecute, which isn't guaranteed, Nia Carter has grounds for a civil suit that could cost you millions. Preston stood and walked to his window, looking out over the manicured grounds of his Buckhead estate. 15 acres of Georgia's finest real estate, a house that had been featured in Architectural Digest, grounds maintained by a staff of 12. All of it bought with money he'd made by being smarter, tougher, more ruthless than everyone else. And now some attorney he'd never met before yesterday was going to take it away because he'd lost his temper for 30 seconds? This is insane, Preston muttered. One mistake, one moment, and they're trying to destroy my entire life. One moment? Richard's voice was sharp. Preston, be honest with yourself for once. This wasn't one moment. This was decades of behavior finally catching up to you. The only difference is this time it happened on camera. Before Preston could respond, his phone lit up with a call from David Chen. He answered immediately. David, thank God. I need you to talk to the board. Explain that the board voted, David interrupted, his voice flat. You're out as CEO effective immediately. Marcus is stepping in as interim. You'll retain your seat, but you're stripped of operational authority. Preston's legs went weak. He sat down heavily in his leather chair. They can't do that without cause. Your contract has a morality clause. Assaulting someone at a public event qualifies. David paused. I'm sorry, Preston, I really am. But the optics are catastrophic. We're already seeing clients pull back. 3 deals that were closing next week are now on hold. Our stock dropped 6% in pre-market trading. The board had no choice. You could have fought for me. You're supposed to be my friend. I'm the president of a bank, Preston, and right now you're toxic. David's voice softened slightly. Look, lay low for a while. Let your attorneys handle this. Maybe in 6 months when things calm down. 6 months? David, I have creditors breathing down my neck right now. The commercial portfolio is bleeding cash. Without the Carter deal, I don't have 6 months. Then I suggest you find another solution, because Meridian Capital can't be associated with this anymore. I'm sorry. The line went dead. Preston stared at his phone, watching his carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time. Richard was talking, saying something about legal strategy and public statements, but Preston wasn't listening. He was thinking about Nia Carter's face as she'd surfaced in that pool. The shock, the fury, the absolute certainty in her eyes that she was going to make him pay for what he'd done. He'd dismissed it in the moment. Another angry woman, another problem his lawyers would solve. But now, watching the consequences multiply with terrifying speed, Preston was beginning to understand that he'd made an enemy who wouldn't be bought off or intimidated into silence. He'd made an enemy with nothing to lose and everything to gain from his complete and total destruction. Across town, in the Morrison and Chase conference room, Nia Carter sat at the head of a table surrounded by 7 of the firm's top attorneys. She'd changed into a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a professional style, every inch the composed litigator. Only the slight shadows under her eyes hinted at a sleepless night spent reviewing case law and planning strategy. Let's be clear about what we're doing here, said Martin Chase, the firm's senior partner. He was 73, silver-haired, and had spent 50 years building Morrison and Chase into the most feared civil rights firm in the Southeast. This isn't just about getting you justice, Nia. This is about taking down a system that's protected men like Preston Waverly for generations. Are you prepared for how ugly this is going to get? I spent last night watching myself get assaulted on every news channel in America, Nia said calmly. It's already ugly. The question is whether we're going to let that ugliness be the end of the story or the beginning. Martin smiled. Good. Then let's talk about how we build the case. But Jennifer Morrison, the other named partner, pulled up a digital timeline on the conference room screen. We've already received 43 calls from former Waverly employees claiming discrimination. 17 are willing to go on record immediately. Another 26 want to talk but are worried about NDAs. Can we break the NDAs? Nia asked. Most of them, yes, Jennifer said. NDAs can't legally cover illegal conduct. If we can establish a pattern of discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, those agreements become unenforceable. We'll need to review each one individually, but I'd estimate 70% are vulnerable. What about documentation? This came from Robert Kim, the firm's litigation specialist. Witnesses are great, but juries love paper trails. That's where things get interesting. Jennifer changed the screen to show an email from Evelyn Marsh. Preston's former assistant contacted us this morning. She's been documenting his discriminatory practices for 2 years. Recordings, emails, internal memos. She says she has enough evidence to prove systematic bias across hiring, promotion, and termination decisions. The room went quiet. Nia leaned forward. Why did she do that? Document it, I mean, if she wasn't planning to use it? She told me she started after witnessing Preston humiliate a young black analyst in front of the entire executive team, Jennifer said quietly. The analyst was brilliant, Harvard MBA, impeccable credentials, but Preston called him diversity hire deadweight and fired him on the spot for a minor error that white employees made regularly without consequence. Evelyn said something broke in her that day. She realized she was complicit in enabling a racist, and she needed insurance in case she ever found the courage to speak up. Saturday night gave her that courage, Nia said. Saturday night gave her a champion, Martin corrected. She saw you stand up to Preston, saw you refuse to be intimidated, saw what he did to you and decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. You're not just a client in this case, Nia. You're a catalyst. Nia absorbed that, feeling the weight of it settle on her shoulders. What's our legal strategy? Robert pulled up a case outline. We file a civil suit for assault, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. That's the foundation. But we also include claims for civil rights violations based on race and gender. We argue that the assault wasn't random. It was the culmination of Preston's pattern of targeting successful black professionals who he perceives as threats to white supremacy. That's going to be controversial, one of the junior attorneys said nervously. Good, Martin said flatly. Controversy means attention. Attention means pressure. Pressure means Preston's allies start running for cover instead of protecting him. He turned to Nia. How's Malcolm handling this? He's furious but focused, Nia said. He killed the Waverly deal permanently yesterday. His board tried to convince him to reconsider. The AI platform could have been a huge revenue stream, but he refused. Said he won't do business with racists, regardless of the cost. That's going to hurt him financially, Jennifer observed. He knows. He doesn't care. Nia's voice held quiet pride. Malcolm built his company on principles. He's not going to compromise them now, Martin nodded approvingly. A husband who puts his wife's dignity over his profit margins. Rare and admirable. He glanced around the table. All right, here's the timeline. We file the civil suit by Wednesday. That gives Preston 48 hours to stew in uncertainty while we finalize the complaint. We make the filing public and hold a press conference announcing our intention to expose the full scope of his discriminatory practices. We invite other victims to come forward. Then we bury him in discovery until he either settles on our terms or faces a jury that's seen video of him assaulting a black woman at a charity gala. What about criminal charges? Nia asked. The DA's office is evaluating. I spoke with their civil rights division this morning. They're interested but cautious. Assault cases without significant injury are notoriously hard to prosecute, especially when the defendant has Preston's resources. Martin's expression hardened. But public pressure changes calculations. If we can build enough momentum, show this wasn't an isolated incident, they might decide prosecution serves the public interest. Naya stood and walked to the window, looking out over downtown Atlanta. Somewhere in this city, Preston Waverly was probably in a similar office, surrounded by similar attorneys, planning his defense. The difference was that Preston's attorneys were trying to contain a disaster, while hers were trying to force a reckoning. "I want to be clear about something," Naya said, turning back to the room. "This isn't about money for me. If we win a settlement, I want it to go toward a foundation that helps people fight discrimination cases. People who can't afford firms like Morrison and Chase, people who get pushed around by men like Preston and have no recourse." "That's your decision to make," Martin said gently. "But Naya, you're entitled to compensation. What he did to you. What he did to me was humiliating and wrong. But I'll recover. I have resources, support, a career that survived this intact." Nia's voice was steady. "The people who can't recover are the ones he fired for being black or female or different. The ones who lost their homes, their savings, their futures because Preston Waverly decided they didn't belong in his world. If we're going to do this, we do it for them. All of them." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Martin Chase, who'd spent half a century fighting battles exactly like this one, smiled with something that looked like fierce satisfaction. "All right then, let's go to war." While the attorneys plotted their strategy, Preston Waverly was discovering that his traditional tools for managing problems had suddenly become useless. He'd called Senator Drummond, expecting her to leverage her political connections to calm the situation. Instead, she'd been icily professional. "Preston, I can't be associated with this. I have an election next year. Being connected to you right now is political suicide. Patricia, we've known each other for 20 years. I've contributed millions to your campaigns. And I appreciate that, but contributions don't buy immunity from consequences when you assault someone on camera." Her voice softened slightly. "I'm sorry, I truly am, but you're on your own with this one." Judge Blackwell had been even more direct. "Don't call me again, Preston. Our friendship can't survive the optics of this situation. If any of your legal troubles end up in my courtroom, I'll recuse myself immediately." One by one, Preston's carefully cultivated relationships evaporated. The people who'd laughed at his jokes, attended his parties, and benefited from his connections suddenly had urgent reasons to be somewhere else. The Atlanta social elite was circling wagons, and Preston was on the outside. By Monday morning, the financial damage was accelerating. Stellar Properties, Preston's flagship commercial real estate division, saw 3 major tenants announce they'd be vacating at the end of their leases rather than renew. The Meridian Capital credit line that had kept Preston's over-leveraged properties afloat was suddenly under routine review that everyone knew meant it was being pulled. 2 pension funds that had invested heavily in Waverly Ventures issued statements condemning Preston's actions and announcing divestment plans. The board meeting was brutal. Marcus Chen, who'd taken over as interim CEO, delivered the numbers with clinical detachment. Revenue projections cut by 40%. Stock value down 18% in 2 trading days. Legal exposure potentially in the tens of millions. Partner companies requesting contract reviews. The AI deal with Carter Technologies, the one thing that might have turned it around, destroyed beyond repair. "We need to discuss succession planning," Marcus said carefully. Preston looked around the conference table at faces he'd known for years. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked uncomfortable. All of them looked like they'd already made up their minds. "You want me to resign?" Preston said flatly. "We want you to consider what's best for the company," Marcus replied. "Your continued presence and leadership is creating liability we can't manage. The longer you stay, the worse this gets for everyone." "This company is mine. I built it from nothing. You can't just—" "We're not taking the company from you," David Chen interrupted. "We're asking you to step back until the legal situation resolves. Retain your shares, keep your board seat, but let someone else run operations while you focus on your defense." "And if I refuse?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They'd force him out if necessary. The morality clause, the shareholder agreements, the bylaws he'd never expected to be used against him. All of it could be weaponized to remove him from the empire he'd spent 40 years building. Preston stood abruptly. "I need time to consider." Take 24 hours, Marcus said. But Preston, understand, one way or another, this is happening. The only question is whether you cooperate or make it uglier for yourself. Preston walked out of the conference room, past assistants who suddenly couldn't meet his eyes, through hallways that felt like they belonged to someone else. He rode the elevator down from the Waverly Tower penthouse, and for the first time since he'd built the building, he wondered if he'd ever be welcome back. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Morrison and Chase had filed the civil suit. The complaint was 53 pages long, and reading it felt like watching his life get autopsied in legal language. Assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil rights violations. And attached to the filing was a statement from Nia Carter that major news outlets were already quoting. No one should be assaulted for refusing to accept racism. No one should be punished for demanding dignity. And no one, regardless of wealth or connections, should be above accountability. This lawsuit is about justice, not just for me, but for everyone Preston Waverly has hurt in his decades of unchecked power. Preston read the words 3 times, feeling rage and fear war in his chest. This wasn't going away. This wasn't a problem his lawyers could solve with settlements and NDAs. This was a woman with resources, determination, and the moral high ground declaring war on everything he'd built. And for the first time in his life, Preston Waverly understood what it felt like to be powerless. That evening, Malcolm Carter sat in his home office reviewing the media coverage with a kind of grim satisfaction. Every major outlet was running the story. Legal analysts were debating Preston's liability. Social media was overwhelmingly supportive of Nia. The video had been viewed millions of times, and every viewing made Preston's defense harder. "You're smiling," Nia said from the doorway. "That's either very good or concerning." Malcolm looked up. "Come see this." She walked around his desk and looked at the screen. It showed a financial news report about Waverly Properties' stock collapse. The analyst was explaining how Preston's assault had triggered a cascade of business failures that threatened the entire company. The Carter Technologies deal was supposed to stabilize their commercial portfolio, the analyst said. Without it, Waverly Properties is looking at potential bankruptcy within 6 to 12 months. And given the ongoing legal exposure, finding alternative financing is going to be extremely difficult. They're predicting his company will collapse, Nia said quietly. Not just predicting, watching it happen in real time. Malcolm pulled up another tab showing market analysis. 3 credit agencies downgraded Waverly's bonds today. That means their borrowing costs just skyrocketed. Their largest creditors are calling loans. They're in a death spiral, Nia. And it all started with that 30-second decision to push you into a pool. Nia was quiet for a moment, processing the scale of what was unfolding. Does that make you happy? Watching his empire burn? Malcolm considered the question carefully. Not happy, but satisfied. He spent decades hurting people and facing no consequences. He thought money and connections made him untouchable. He was wrong. And now everyone can see exactly how wrong he was. What about your company? The AI platform was a huge opportunity. We'll find other opportunities. Better ones. With people who don't assault my wife at charity galas. Malcolm turned to face her fully. Nia, I meant what I said Saturday night. You are worth more than any business deal, and any partnership that requires me to stay silent about racism and violence isn't one I want anyway. Nia leaned down and kissed him softly. You know this is going to get worse before it gets better. Preston's going to fight back. He'll try to discredit me, paint himself as the victim, drag us through the mud. Let him try. We have the truth, the law, and about 100 videos showing exactly what happened. Plus, if Evelyn Marsh's evidence is as comprehensive as your firm thinks, we have documentation of a pattern that makes Saturday night look like the inevitable conclusion rather than an isolated incident. Martin wants to hold a press conference Wednesday after the filing goes public. Good. What do you want to say? Nia walked to the window looking out at their neighborhood. Nice houses, good schools, the kind of place where people like them could build lives and raise families. The kind of place Preston Waverly thought they didn't deserve to be. I want to say that dignity isn't negotiable, that being successful while black doesn't mean accepting abuse, that there are consequences for racism regardless of how rich or connected you are. She turned back to Malcolm. But mostly, I want other people who've been pushed around by men like Preston to know they're not alone. That fighting back is possible. That justice, when you have the courage to demand it, is achievable. Malcolm stood and joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her waist. Then that's what you'll say. And every person who's ever been on the receiving end of Preston's cruelty is going to hear it and know that things are finally changing. They stood together in the gathering darkness, watching Atlanta's lights come on across the city. Somewhere in that sprawl of homes and offices, Preston Waverly was probably staring at his own window, watching the same city, feeling his power drain away like water circling a drain. The battle lines had been drawn. The first shots had been fired. And the war that was coming would determine whether men like Preston could still hurt people without consequences, or whether the world had finally changed enough to hold them accountable. Nia Carter was betting everything on accountability. And she was about to prove that when you push the right person, they don't just push back. They dismantle your entire world, piece by carefully documented piece, until there's nothing left but the truth you tried so hard to hide. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Atlanta feel almost optimistic, though for Preston Waverly, the weather was just another cruel irony. He stood in his attorney's office on the 14th floor of a downtown high-rise, watching the street below fill with news vans and reporters gathering for Nia Carter's press conference. They'd set up across the street at the Morrison and Chase building, cameras pointed at the entrance like weapons waiting to fire. Richard Morehouse ended a phone call and turned to Preston with an expression that had gone from concerned to genuinely worried over the past 72 hours. The complaint is worse than we anticipated. They've documented 47 separate incidents spanning 12 years. Wrongful termination, hostile work environment, discriminatory hiring practices, and that's just the preview. They're saying they have recordings. Preston's hands clenched on the windowsill. Evelyn. Almost certainly. My contacts at Morrison and Chase confirmed they've been meeting with her extensively. She's providing both documentation and testimony. Richard pulled up the court filing on his laptop. Preston, some of these allegations are damning. There's a recording of you allegedly telling her to find a reason to fire the black guy in accounting because you didn't like how he carried himself. Another, where you supposedly said you wouldn't promote women to executive positions because they get emotional and can't handle pressure. Those conversations were private, Preston said, his voice tight with rage. She had no right. She had every right. You don't own her loyalty, and recording workplace discrimination isn't illegal in Georgia as long as one party consents. Richard closed the laptop. The question now is how we respond. Morrison and Chase is about to paint you as a systematic abuser of civil rights. We need a counter-narrative. The truth, that I made a mistake Saturday night, that I apologized. You haven't apologized. Not publicly, not privately, not in any way that matters legally. Richard's voice was sharp. And that's part of the problem. You've been silent for 3 days while Nia Carter has controlled the entire narrative. Every news cycle has been about her dignity and your violence. Every legal analyst has been discussing your liability. Every social media platform has been sharing that video. You've ceded the battlefield completely. Preston turned from the window, his face flushed. What would you have me do? Grovel? Beg forgiveness from someone who's trying to destroy everything I've built? I'd have you show basic human decency and strategic intelligence. An immediate apology might have contained this. Resignation from your company with dignity intact might have salvaged your reputation. Instead, you fought every step, and now you look exactly like what they're accusing you of being, an arrogant racist who thinks he's above consequences. The words landed like physical blows. Preston wanted to fire Richard, wanted to throw him out of the office, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all. But he couldn't afford to lose another ally, not when so few remained. Fine, Preston said through clenched teeth. Draft an apology. Make it sound sincere. It needs to be sincere, Preston. If you don't mean it, people will know. Richard paused. Do you regret what you did? Do you understand why it was wrong? Preston wanted to say yes, wanted to perform the contrition that would make this easier. But the truth was more complicated and uglier. He regretted getting caught, regretted the consequences, regretted that his moment of rage had been captured by 100 phones. But did he regret putting Nia Carter in her place, Standing up to the changing world that made him feel obsolete and angry? That was harder to answer honestly. Richard saw the hesitation and sighed. That's what I thought. Preston, until you can genuinely acknowledge what you did wrong, any apology is just damage control, and Morrison and Chase will tear it apart. Across the street, Nia Carter stepped up to a podium that had been set up outside the Morrison and Chase building. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was both professional and powerful, her hair pulled back elegantly, her expression calm but resolute. Behind her stood Martin Chase, Jennifer Morrison, and a dozen other attorneys from the firm. To her left was a row of empty chairs with name placards, though the names were currently facing away from the cameras. The crowd of reporters fell silent as Nia adjusted the microphone. She looked directly into the cameras with the kind of steady confidence that came from knowing you were right and having the evidence to prove it. "Thank you all for coming," Nia began, her voice clear and strong. "On Saturday evening, I attended a charity gala where I was verbally harassed and then physically assaulted by Preston Waverly, a man I had never met before that night. The assault was witnessed by hundreds of people and recorded by dozens of phones. The videos have been viewed millions of times. The facts are not in dispute." She paused, letting that sink in. Preston watched from his window, his jaw tight. But this case is about more than one assault. It's about a pattern of behavior that spans decades. A system of discrimination that has hurt countless people who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. Today, Morrison and Chase filed a comprehensive civil suit against Preston Waverly and Waverly Properties. "We're seeking accountability not just for what happened to me, but for years of documented discrimination against employees based on race, gender, and other protected characteristics." Nia gestured to the chairs behind her. "I'm not alone in this fight. Joining me today are 7 former Waverly Properties employees who experienced discrimination firsthand. They're here to share their stories and to show that Saturday night wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of unchecked prejudice and power." The first person stood and walked to the podium as Nia stepped aside. He was a black man in his early 30s, wearing a well-cut suit, his expression serious but determined. "My name is Marcus Thompson. I worked at Waverly Properties for 3 years as a financial analyst. I was hired based on my credentials, Harvard MBA, 5 years at Goldman Sachs. But from my first day, Preston Waverly made it clear I wasn't welcome. He called me diversity hire in meetings, questioned my analysis in ways he never questioned white colleagues. And when I made a minor error in a quarterly report, the kind of mistake that happens in any fast-paced environment, he fired me in front of the entire executive team and told me I was proof that affirmative action lowered standards." Marcus's voice didn't waver, but his hands gripped the podium. "I was humiliated, devastated. I'd built my entire career on excellence, and Preston Waverly destroyed my reputation in 30 seconds because he couldn't accept that a black man could be as good at finance as he was. I signed an NDA as part of my severance, but watching what he did to Nia Carter made me realize that silence enables abuse. I'm breaking that NDA today because some things are more important than money." He stepped back, and a woman in her 40s came forward. She was white, professional, carrying herself with quiet dignity. "I'm Elizabeth Chen. I worked at Waverly Properties for 7 years, rising to Senior Vice President of Operations. I was good at my job, increased efficiency by 23%, managed a team of 45 people, consistently exceeded targets. When the executive VP position opened up, I was the obvious choice. I'd been groomed for it, promised it. But Preston gave the job to a man with half my experience and none of my track record. When I asked why, he told me that executive leadership required someone who could handle pressure without getting emotional, and that women just aren't built for that level of stress." Elizabeth's voice was controlled, but anger flickered in her eyes. "I filed an internal complaint. HR buried it. I considered a lawsuit, but didn't have the resources to fight a company with unlimited legal budgets. So I left, found a better job where my gender wasn't a liability. But I've carried that anger for 5 years. Watching Preston assault Nia Carter, watching him lash out at a successful woman who refused to accept his prejudice, I knew I had to speak up. Some men only learn when they lose everything." One by one, the former employees told their stories. a Hispanic project manager who'd been passed over for promotions despite stellar performance reviews, an Asian American attorney who'd been told she wasn't aggressive enough for courtroom work when white male colleagues with identical temperaments were praised as thoughtful, a gay facilities director who'd been fired after Preston discovered his sexual orientation and decided he couldn't represent the company's values, a black woman in accounting who'd filed a sexual harassment complaint against a senior executive and found herself terminated 2 weeks later for performance issues that materialized only after she spoke up. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its pattern. Preston Waverly and his company systematically discriminated against anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of who deserved power and respect. And each person who tried to challenge that system had been crushed, silenced, or paid off. Preston watched from across the street, his face pale, his hands shaking with rage. "This is character assassination. They're coordinating lies to destroy me." "They're telling the truth," Richard said quietly, "and you know it." Preston spun on him. "Whose side are you on?" "Yours. Which is why I'm telling you the truth. Nobody else will. You did these things, Preston. Maybe not exactly the way they're describing, maybe with justifications that made sense in your head, but you did them. And now it's all coming out, and there's no amount of legal maneuvering that can make it go away." On the street below, Nia had returned to the podium. "These 7 people are brave, but they're not alone." Since Saturday, Morrison & Chase has been contacted by 63 former Waverly employees with similar stories. We're reviewing each case individually, and we expect that number to grow. We're also working with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Georgia Commission on Equal Opportunity to investigate systematic discrimination at Waverly properties. She looked directly into the camera, and for a moment it felt like she was looking straight at Preston. To anyone who has experienced discrimination from Preston Waverly or his company, you don't have to stay silent. You don't have to accept that powerful people can hurt you without consequences. Morrison & Chase is committed to fighting for justice, and we have the resources to take this as far as necessary. Come forward. Tell your truth. Together, we can ensure that no one else has to experience what we experienced. The press conference ended with a barrage of questions from reporters. Nia handled them with the skill of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms, never defensive, always in control. When asked if she wanted Preston to go to jail, she responded calmly that she wanted accountability through whatever legal means were appropriate. When asked about the settlement amount she was seeking, she said the lawsuit wasn't about enriching herself, but about forcing systematic change. When asked if she hated Preston Waverly, she paused for just a moment before answering. "I don't hate Preston Waverly. I pity him. He had wealth, success, and influence, and he used all of it to hurt people who were different from him. He could have been a leader who lifted others up. Instead, he became exactly what we're fighting against, a symbol of unchecked privilege and casual cruelty. That's not hate. That's just incredibly sad." The answer was perfect, Preston realized with growing horror. She'd positioned herself as reasonable, principled, motivated by justice rather than revenge. She'd made herself sympathetic while making him monstrous, and she'd done it all without raising her voice or breaking her professional composure. "We need to respond," Preston said desperately. "Call our own press conference. Present our side." "What side, Bassam?" Richard asked. "The side where you didn't actually assault her? The side where those 7 people are lying? The side where Evelyn Marsh fabricated recordings? Preston, there is no good side to this story for you. The only question is how much worse you make it by continuing to fight." "So I should just give up? Let them take everything?" "I'm saying you should consider what you're fighting for and what it's going to cost." Richard pulled up financial projections on his laptop. "If this goes to trial and you lose, you're looking at potential damages in the tens of millions. That's on top of the financial collapse that's already happening. Waverly Properties lost 2 more major tenants this morning. Your credit lines are being called. The commercial portfolio is underwater. You're going to lose the company either way. The question is whether you also lose your personal assets, your freedom if criminal charges are filed, and whatever shred of reputation you might still salvage." Preston slumped into a chair, the fight draining out of him. For the first time since Saturday night, he allowed himself to truly see the scope of the disaster. His company was dying. His allies had abandoned him. His reputation was destroyed. And across the street, Nia Carter was calmly explaining to the world exactly how and why he deserved everything that was happening to him. "What do I do?" Preston asked, and his voice sounded broken even to his own ears. Richard closed his laptop and sat down across from him. "You make a choice. You can keep fighting, burn through your remaining assets on legal fees, drag this out for years, and almost certainly lose everything, including possibly your freedom. Or you can negotiate a settlement that includes a genuine apology, meaningful financial accountability, and cooperation with the systemic reforms Morrison and Chase is demanding. You'll still lose a lot, but you might retain something. They want me to admit I'm a racist. They want you to acknowledge that you engaged in discriminatory practices and that it caused real harm to real people. Which is true, Preston. It's all true. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start figuring out how to survive this." Preston stared at the floor, feeling older than his 58 years. Somewhere in the building below, his phone was probably exploding with messages from board members demanding he resign, creditors demanding payment, former friends demanding distance. The empire he'd built was collapsing, and the worst part was knowing that he'd triggered the demolition himself with 30 seconds of rage-fueled stupidity. "Set up a meeting with Morrison and Chase," Preston finally said. "Let's see what kind of settlement they're willing to discuss." Richard nodded, relief flickering across his face. "That's the smartest thing you've said all week." While Preston was finally confronting reality, Malcolm Carter was in his own office dealing with the aftermath of the press conference. His phone had been ringing constantly with reporters, investors, and business contacts all wanting his perspective on the situation. His company's profile had skyrocketed, not because of the AI platform they'd built, but because Malcolm Carter had killed a $100 million deal to defend his wife's dignity. "You're trending on 3 different platforms," his communications director said, pulling up social media analytics. "Mostly positive. People are calling you a model husband, praising your integrity, using this as an example of how business leaders should prioritize values over profits." "That's nice, but I didn't do it for the publicity," Malcolm said, studying quarterly projections. "How are we actually doing? Revenue, partnerships, investor confidence?" "Better than expected. We lost the Waverly deal, obviously, but we've had 7 new partnership inquiries since Monday. 3 major tech companies that want to license the AI platform. 2 venture capital firms that want to invest in our next round. It turns out that publicly standing up to racism is good for business, at least with the kinds of partners we want." Malcolm smiled despite himself. "So doing the right thing didn't actually hurt us?" "Not even close. If anything, you've positioned Carter Technologies as a company with principles. In the current climate, that's valuable." The communications director paused. "We have been getting some negative feedback, mostly from people in Preston's circle, claiming you torpedoed the deal for political reasons or that you overreacted. Let them claim whatever they want. I watched a man assault my wife. There's no overreaction to that." "Agreed. I'm just letting you know the landscape." She closed her laptop. "For what it's worth, I think you did exactly the right thing, not just morally, but strategically. Companies that tolerate discrimination end up in lawsuits like the one Morrison and Chase just filed. You avoided that entire liability by cutting ties immediately." After she left, Malcolm sat alone in his office thinking about the strange path that had led here. 4 days ago, he'd been negotiating what seemed like the deal of his career. Now he was turning down partnership offers because he couldn't stomach the people behind them. The math should have added up to disaster, but somehow it had added up to opportunity. His phone buzzed with the text from Nia. "Press conference went well, coming home, love you." He texted back, "Proud of you. Dinner's on me tonight. Anywhere you want." What Malcolm didn't include in the text, but what he'd been thinking about constantly since Saturday night, was how close he'd come to making the wrong choice. If Nia hadn't warned him about Preston, if he'd been so focused on the business opportunity that he'd dismissed her concerns, if he'd prioritized profit over principles and ended up in partnership with a man who would eventually show his true nature in some catastrophic way, the AI platform would have been successful, but at what cost to his integrity and his marriage? Sometimes, Malcolm reflected, the best business decisions looked like walking away. Across town at Morrison and Chase, the legal team was celebrating their successful press conference while also preparing for the war they knew was coming. Martin Chase gathered everyone in the conference room and pulled up the afternoon's news coverage. Every major outlet had run stories about the press conference. Legal analysts were discussing the strength of the case. Social media was overwhelmingly supportive. The narrative was firmly in their favor. "This is good," Martin said, "but don't get complacent. Preston's attorneys are going to come back hard. They'll try to discredit our witnesses, challenge Evelyn's recordings, paint Nia as opportunistic or vindictive. We need to be ready for everything." "What about settlement discussions?" Jennifer Morrison asked. His attorney reached out an hour ago requesting a meeting. "Already?" Robert Kim looked surprised. "I expected them to fight for at least a few weeks before considering settlement." "The financial pressure is probably unbearable," Martin said. "Preston's company is bleeding money. Every day this drags out costs him millions in lost business and legal fees. He's trying to contain the damage before it destroys him completely." He turned to Nia. "What do you want to do? Are you open to settlement discussions?" Nia considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted to see this through to a trial, wanted Preston to face a jury that had watched him assault her on video. But another part, the practical attorney part, understood that settlements could achieve meaningful change faster than years of litigation. "I'm open to discussions," Nia said slowly, "but our terms are non-negotiable. Full public apology acknowledging the assault and the pattern of discrimination. Substantial financial settlement that goes toward establishing a foundation for discrimination victims. Cooperation with all ongoing investigations. Systematic reforms at Waverly Properties, including independent oversight of hiring and promotion practices. And Preston resigns from operational control of his company." "Those are significant demands," Robert observed. "He might not agree to all of them." "Then we go to trial and ask a jury for even more," Nia said flatly. "I'm not interested in a quiet settlement that lets Preston buy his way out of consequences. Either he acknowledges what he did and commits to real change, or we make sure everyone knows exactly who he is and what he's done." Martin smiled with fierce approval. "All right then. Jennifer, set up the meeting. Make sure they understand these are opening positions, not negotiating points. We're not here to help Preston save face. We're here to force accountability." The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at a neutral location, a conference room at the Ritz-Carlton that neither side could claim as home turf. Preston arrived with Richard Morehouse and 2 other attorneys, all of them looking exhausted and grim. Nia arrived with Martin, Jennifer, and Robert, all of them looking focused and ready for battle. They sat across from each other at a long mahogany table, and for a moment nobody spoke. Preston looked at Nia for the first time since Saturday night, and something in his expression suggested he was finally seeing her as a person rather than an obstacle. She looked back steadily, waiting. "Mrs. Carter," Preston began, his voice rough. "I want to apologize for what happened at the gala. It was inappropriate and wrong. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I deeply regret my actions." Nia didn't respond immediately. She studied Preston with the same analytical focus she brought to cross-examination, looking for sincerity, finding mostly fear and desperation. "Do you regret assaulting me, Mr. Waverly? Or do you regret getting caught on camera?" Preston flinched. "I regret both, but mostly I regret hurting you. You didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that." "What about the things you said before you pushed me? About people like me not belonging in rooms like that? About fundamental realities and breeding? Do you regret those sentiments, or just saying them out loud?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Preston's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Richard opened his mouth to intervene, but Preston held up a hand. "I regret that too," Preston said quietly. "I was raised in a different time with different values. That's not an excuse, just context. I've built my career on certain beliefs about merit and hierarchy, and when the world changed around me, I got angry instead of adapting. I took that anger out on people who didn't deserve it. People like you who've earned every bit of your success, but who I couldn't accept because it challenged my understanding of how things should be." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I am genuinely sorry for the pain I've caused." It was the most honest thing Preston had said in years, and everyone in the room recognized it. Nia felt something shift slightly, not forgiveness, but perhaps the possibility of resolution. "Apologies are a start," Martin Chase said, pulling the conversation back to business. But words need to be backed by actions. We have settlement terms. For the next 3 hours, they negotiated with the intensity of people who understood that everything was on the line. Preston's attorneys tried to reduce financial exposure, eliminate the public apology requirement, and minimize oversight provisions. Morrison and Chase held firm on every major point. By the time the sun was setting over Atlanta, they'd reached an agreement that left nobody completely happy, but that achieved Nia's core objectives. Preston would issue a comprehensive public apology, acknowledging both the assault and the pattern of discrimination. He would pay a settlement of $12 million to establish the Carter Foundation for Civil Rights Litigation, which would provide legal support for discrimination cases. He would resign as CEO of Waverly Properties, but retain a minority ownership stake. The company would implement independent oversight of all hiring, promotion, and termination decisions for a minimum of 5 years. And Preston would cooperate fully with all ongoing investigations by the EEOC and other regulatory agencies. In exchange, Nia would drop the civil suit and agree not to pursue additional litigation related to the assault. The other former employees who'd come forward would receive their own individual settlements contingent on signing releases. And Morrison and Chase would issue a statement acknowledging Preston's cooperation and expressing hope that this marked a turning point toward accountability. "Do we have a deal?" Martin asked as they reviewed the final settlement terms. Preston looked at this document that would effectively end his career as he'd known it. Everything he'd built, reduced to minority ownership and mandatory oversight. His reputation, destroyed and unlikely to ever recover. His fortune, significantly diminished and redirected toward helping the very people he'd spent years marginalizing. But the alternative was complete destruction. Criminal charges. Years of litigation, bankruptcy, prison, possibly. At least this way he retained something, some money, some dignity, some possibility of eventually rebuilding a smaller, humbler life. "We have a deal," Preston said, and signed his name on the line that marked the end of his empire. The settlement was announced on Monday morning through carefully coordinated press releases that hit every major news outlet simultaneously. Preston's statement was read by Richard Morehouse at a press conference. Preston himself couldn't bring himself to attend, his absence speaking louder than any words could have. The attorney stood at a podium, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a week, reading words that had been drafted, redrafted, and scrutinized by teams of lawyers until they carried the weight of genuine contrition. Preston Waverly accepts full responsibility for his assault on Nia Carter at the Nexus Foundation gala. His actions were indefensible, motivated by prejudice, and caused significant harm not only to Mrs. Carter, but to the broader community that witnessed his violence. He also acknowledges a pattern of discriminatory behavior throughout his career that created hostile environments for employees based on race, gender, and other protected characteristics. This behavior was wrong. It violated both ethical standards and legal protections, and it caused real damage to real people who deserved better. Mr. Waverly is profoundly sorry for the pain he has caused and is committed to making meaningful amends through the settlement terms agreed upon with Morrison and Chase. The room erupted with questions, but Richard simply placed the statement on the podium and walked away. There would be no follow-up, no clarifications, no opportunity for Preston to somehow undermine his own apology with defensive justifications. The words would stand alone, permanent and unambiguous. At Morrison and Chase, Nia watched the press conference on the conference room television, surrounded by her legal team. When Richard finished reading and left the podium, Martin Chase muted the sound and turned to face her. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. Nia took a moment to inventory her emotions. Relief, certainly, that the immediate legal battle was over. Satisfaction that Preston had been forced to acknowledge his wrongdoing publicly. But also a strange emptiness, the way soldiers must feel when a war ends and they're left processing everything that happened in the silence that follows. "I feel like we won," Nia said slowly. "But I also feel like winning shouldn't have required getting assaulted on camera. Like we only got justice because the evidence was so overwhelming that even Preston's lawyers couldn't spin it away. What about all the people who get pushed around without phones recording? What about the victims who don't have the resources or platform to fight back?" "That's why we created the foundation," Jennifer Morrison reminded her. $12 million might not undo the harm Preston caused, but it will fund a lot of cases for people who couldn't otherwise afford to fight." "I know, and I'm grateful for that. It's just, Nia struggled to articulate the feeling. I wanted to believe that the system would work because it was right, not because we had irrefutable video evidence and a defendant whose company was collapsing. I wanted accountability to be easier than this. Martin walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. Accountability is never easy when you're challenging power, but you did it anyway. You stood up to a man who thought he was untouchable, and you proved he wasn't. That matters. Not just for you, but for everyone who's watching and learning that fighting back is possible. Robert Kim pulled up social media on the conference room screen. She's right to feel conflicted, but look at the impact. The hashtag is trending worldwide. Hundreds of people are sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination. 3 other companies are now facing employee lawsuits inspired by our case. The EEOC announced they're launching investigations into 4 major corporations based on tips they've received in the past week. Nia, you didn't just get justice for yourself, you triggered a wave of accountability. Nia studied the screen, watching stories scroll past from people she'd never met in cities she'd never visited, all of them finding courage because one woman had refused to accept being pushed into a pool. The scope of it was overwhelming and humbling at the same time. We need to make sure the foundation is structured to handle this, Nia said, her attorney mind shifting into practical mode. If we're going to be supporting discrimination cases, we need experienced litigators, solid screening processes, sustainable funding models. This can't just be a symbolic gesture, it has to be a functioning resource. Already working on it, Jennifer said. We've identified 3 senior attorneys who want to join the Foundation's board. We're establishing criteria for case selection that prioritize impact and likelihood of success. And we're setting up partnerships with law schools to create internship programs that give students experience in civil rights litigation. What about Evelyn Marsh? Nia asked. She's the one who made this possible. Without her documentation, we might not have had the leverage to force settlement. Martin smiled. Evelyn's been offered a position as the Foundation's Director of Investigations. She'll oversee documentation of discrimination cases and help other whistleblowers navigate the process of coming forward safely. Turns out 8 years of watching Preston operate taught her exactly what kind of evidence is needed to prove systematic discrimination. She accepted? Immediately. Said she spent too many years being complicit. Now she wants to spend the rest of her career making it right. Nia felt some of the emptiness start to fill with something that felt like hope. Maybe accountability was hard, but it was also contagious. One person standing up gave others permission to do the same. One lawsuit created templates for others to follow. One victory proved that power wasn't as invincible as it pretended to be. When do we officially launch the Foundation? Nia asked. 2 weeks. We'll hold a proper event, announce the board, explain the mission and application process. We're calling it the Carter Foundation for Civil Rights Litigation, but it's really about creating the support system you wished you'd had when you were facing Preston alone. I wasn't alone, Nia corrected gently. I had Malcolm. I had this firm. I had resources most people don't have. That's the point. Nobody should need to be as lucky as I was to get justice. While Nia was building the foundation that would carry her fight forward, Preston Waverly was discovering what life looked like on the other side of accountability. He'd moved out of the Waverly Tower penthouse office the day after signing the settlement, packing up 40 years of accumulated power into bankers' boxes while former colleagues avoided eye contact in the hallways. The board had wasted no time installing Marcus Chen as permanent CEO, and Marcus had wasted no time implementing the oversight provisions required by the settlement. Preston's name was being quietly removed from company materials. The Waverly Properties sign outside the headquarters would be changed to Stellar Holdings within the month, erasing Preston's legacy from the very building he'd constructed as a monument to himself. His remaining ownership stake gave him quarterly dividend checks, but no authority, no influence, no voice in the company's direction. He'd retreated to his Buckhead estate, and it was there that the true isolation became apparent. The friends who'd once filled his calendar with golf games and dinner parties had evaporated. The social clubs that had welcomed him for decades suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever he tried to make reservations. The charitable boards he'd sat on requested his resignation, politely but firmly making clear that his presence was now a liability rather than an asset. Even his family had distanced themselves. His ex-wife, They'd divorced 15 years earlier, sent a brief email saying she hoped he'd find peace, but requesting he not contact her again. His daughter, who lived in California and had always maintained a careful distance from her father's world, sent a longer message that cut deeper. Dad, I've watched the video probably 50 times. I keep hoping I'll see something different, some explanation that makes it less awful. But every time, I just see you pushing that woman into a pool because she wouldn't accept your racism. I've spent my whole life making excuses for you, telling myself you were a product of your generation, that you didn't mean the things you said, that deep down you were a good person. I can't do that anymore. What you did wasn't just wrong. It was cruel. And the fact that it took getting caught on camera for you to apologize tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. I think we both need time and distance. Please don't contact me unless you've done genuine work to change, not just work to manage the consequences. Preston read the email sitting in his home office, the same office where he'd once felt so powerful and felt something inside him crack. His daughter was right. His ex-wife was right. Nia Carter was right. Everyone was right except him. And the realization was devastating because it meant that everything he'd built his identity around was fundamentally flawed. He'd thought power and wealth made him important. He'd thought success justified his prejudices. He'd thought that being smart enough to get rich meant he was right about everything else. And now, stripped of the company and the respect and the social standing, Preston was forced to confront the possibility that he'd wasted his entire life building an empire on a foundation of cruelty and entitlement. The doorbell rang, pulling Preston from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. Barely anyone knew he was home, and fewer still would risk association by visiting. But when he opened the door, he found Evelyn Marsh standing on his porch, holding a small box. "Evelyn," Preston said, genuinely surprised. "I didn't think I'd see you again." "You almost didn't," she replied, her voice neutral. "But I thought you deserved an explanation. May I come in?" Preston stepped aside, and she walked into the foyer of the house she'd visited dozens of times for holiday parties and business dinners. But now the dynamic was completely inverted. She was the one with power, and he was the one vulnerable. They sat in the living room, and Evelyn placed the box on the coffee table between them. "That's the last of the files from your office, personal items the company asked me to return." "Thank you." Preston looked at the box without opening it. "That's not why you came, though." "No." Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "I came because I spent 8 years working for you, and I think I owe you honesty. You were the worst boss I ever had, Preston. Not because you were demanding or difficult, but because you were casually cruel in ways I don't think you even recognized. You'd make racist comments about candidates during hiring reviews like you were discussing their qualifications. You'd dismiss women's ideas in meetings and then praise men who said the exact same thing 5 minutes later. You'd create hostile environments and then act confused when people complained." Preston flinched but didn't interrupt. "I documented everything because I knew that someday it would matter. I didn't know when or how, but I knew that men like you don't change until forced to face consequences. And then I watched you push Nia Carter into that pool, and I realized that the time had come. Not because I hated you, though there were days I came close, but because staying silent was making me complicit in your harm." "I never meant to hurt anyone," Preston said quietly. "That's the problem. You never thought about whether you were hurting people. You only thought about whether you were getting what you wanted." Evelyn stood, preparing to leave. "I accepted the position at the Carter Foundation. I'm going to spend the rest of my career helping people fight bosses like you, and I'm going to use everything I learned working for you to make sure they win." "I understand. And Evelyn, I am sorry. For all of it." She paused at the door. "Good. Being sorry is a start. Sorry. But sorry doesn't mean much unless it changes how you live going forward. The question isn't whether you regret getting caught. It's whether you're willing to do the actual work of becoming someone different." After she left, Preston sat alone in his expensive house filled with expensive things that suddenly felt meaningless. He walked through rooms designed to impress, past art collected to demonstrate taste, through spaces that had hosted parties for people who no longer took his calls. The house was a museum to a life that no longer existed, and Preston was its only visitor. He ended up in his study, surrounded by books he'd never read, and awards he'd never earned through anything but financial success. On the shelf was a photograph from 20 years earlier, Preston, at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for one of his first major properties, surrounded by city officials and employees, everyone smiling for the cameras. He thought that day marked the beginning of an empire. Now he understood it was just one point along a path that led inevitably to assault, lawsuit, and collapse. His phone buzzed with a news alert. The Carter Foundation had announced its board of directors and was officially accepting case applications. Nia Carter's photo accompanied the article, and she looked confident and purposeful in a way that made Preston ache with something that felt like envy. She'd taken the worst thing he'd ever done to anyone and transformed it into a resource for justice. She'd won not just legally, but morally, completely and absolutely. Preston opened his laptop, and for the first time since the assault, allowed himself to read the comments on the videos. Thousands of them, from people all over the world, and the overwhelming message was the same. Nia Carter was a hero, and Preston Waverly was exactly the kind of privileged bigot that society needed to hold accountable. There were some defenders, people claiming he'd been set up, or that the assault was exaggerated, but they were drowned out by the chorus of voices celebrating his downfall. He closed the laptop and sat in the silence of his study, feeling the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he'd never actually had. The respect he'd thought he commanded was really just fear and calculation. The friendships he'd believed in were really just mutually beneficial arrangements. The legacy he'd hoped to leave was really just a trail of people he'd hurt. For the first time in his adult life, Preston Waverly cried. Not for what had happened to him, though that was part of it, but for all the years he'd wasted being the kind of person who would push a woman into a pool because she refused to accept his hatred. For all the careers he'd damaged and lives he'd disrupted and pain he'd caused because his prejudices mattered more to him than other people's humanity. The tears didn't change anything. They didn't undo the assault or erase the discrimination or restore his reputation, but they marked something important. The first genuine recognition that he'd been wrong. Not wrong to get caught, but wrong in his fundamental approach to life and power and other human beings. It was a start, a small, insufficient start. But it was something. Meanwhile, Malcolm Carter was navigating his own transformation. Carter Technologies had become one of the most talked about companies in tech, not because of their AI platform, though that continued to generate interest, but because of Malcolm's very public decision to prioritize principles over profits. The story of a CEO who killed a $100 million deal to defend his wife had resonated far beyond business circles. "You've become a symbol," his CFO said during their weekly strategy meeting. "People are using you as an example of ethical leadership. Harvard Business School wants you to speak about decision-making under pressure. 3 different podcasts want interviews about balancing business and values. And we've gotten partnership inquiries from companies that specifically cited your handling of the Waverly situation as why they want to work with us." Malcolm shook his head with a mixture of pride and discomfort. "I just defended my wife. That shouldn't be remarkable." "But it is. Because most people in your position would have tried to separate the personal from the professional, would have continued the Waverly deal despite what Preston did. You didn't. You made it clear that who you do business with matters as much as the business itself. In the current climate, that's powerful." "What's our actual financial position?" Malcolm asked, redirecting to concrete numbers. The CFO pulled up quarterly projections. "Strong. We're up 23% in new contracts compared to this time last year. The AI platform has 3 major licensees and another 5 in serious negotiations. We're on track to exceed revenue targets by 30%, and our valuation has increased significantly because investors see us as both innovative and ethical." So walking away from Preston didn't hurt us. It helped us, because the companies that wanted to work with Waverly Properties were the kind of partners we wouldn't want anyway. The companies reaching out now are aligned with our values: better cultural fit, lower risk of future conflicts, stronger long-term potential. The CFO paused. "Malcolm, you made the right call for the right reasons, and it turned out to also be the right call for business reasons. That's rare. Take the win." After the meeting, Malcolm found himself thinking about the path not taken. If he'd ignored Nia's warnings about Preston, if he'd compartmentalized the assault as personal and kept the business relationship intact, if he'd prioritized short-term profit over long-term integrity, where would he be now? Probably embroiled in his own scandal, Malcolm realized. Because men like Preston didn't change behavior just because the context changed. The same prejudices that led him to assault Nia would have eventually poisoned the business partnership. There would have been discriminatory comments in meetings, inappropriate behavior toward employees, decisions based on bias rather than merit. And Malcolm would have been complicit in all of it, his silence and continued partnership signaling that he tolerated Preston's values. He called Nia, who answered on the second ring. "Hey, how was the strategy meeting?" "Productive. They're telling me I'm a symbol of ethical leadership." Nia laughed. "How does that feel?" "Weird. I just did what seemed right." "That's what makes it symbolic. Most people don't do what seems right when it costs them money." Her voice softened. "I'm proud of you. For the deal you killed, for standing with me, for building a company that actually means something beyond profit margins." "I'm proud of you too. The foundation is going to change lives." "I hope so. We already have 27 case applications. Stories that would break your heart. People who've been fighting discrimination alone for years, burning through savings on legal fees, facing companies with unlimited resources. If we can help even a fraction of them, it'll be worth everything we went through." They talked for a few more minutes before Nia had to go to another meeting. After hanging up, Malcolm stood at his office window looking out over Atlanta. Somewhere in this city, Preston Waverly was probably in a similar office having very different thoughts. Two men who'd almost been partners, now on completely opposite trajectories, one rising because he'd chosen integrity, one falling because he'd chosen cruelty. The contrast was stark and instructive. Success built on exploitation was always temporary. Success built on principles might be harder to achieve, but it was sustainable. You could sleep at night. You could look at yourself in the mirror. You could build relationships based on genuine respect rather than calculated advantage. Malcolm had always believed that, but the past week had proven it in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Doing the right thing hadn't destroyed his business, it had elevated it. Standing by his wife hadn't cost him opportunities, it had attracted better ones. Refusing to compromise his values hadn't left him isolated, it had surrounded him with people who shared those values. The world was changing, slowly and imperfectly, but changing nonetheless. The old model of business, where power excused prejudice and profit justified cruelty, was dying. It wasn't dead yet. Preston Waverly was proof there were still too many men who thought they could operate that way. But each time someone like Nia fought back and won, each time someone like Malcolm chose principles over profits, each time consequences actually caught up to people who'd thought themselves immune, the old model lost a little more ground. Malcolm turned back to his desk and pulled up the latest AI platform demonstrations. This was still what drove him, the innovation, the problem-solving, the excitement of building something new. But now it was embedded in a framework that mattered beyond the technical achievement. Carter Technologies wasn't just creating software. They were proving that you could be successful and ethical, profitable and principled, ambitious and accountable. That was a legacy worth building. Not monuments to ego like the Waverly Tower, but systems that lifted people up instead of pushing them down. Not empire for its own sake, but impact that actually mattered. Not power that demanded submission, but influence earned through respect. The phone rang again. Another interview request, another speaking invitation. Another opportunity to tell the story of how choosing integrity over expedience had worked out better than anyone expected. Malcolm accepted because he understood something important. Visibility mattered. Every time he talked about walking away from Preston's deal, he gave permission to other business leaders to do the same. Every time he emphasized that values weren't separate from business but central to it, he shifted the culture a little bit further toward accountability. One conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one person standing up and saying, "This is wrong and I won't be part of it," at a time. That was how change happened. Not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through thousands of small moments where people chose difficult right over easy wrong, where they stood with victims instead of staying silent, where they prioritized humanity over profit margins, and discovered that humanity and profit didn't have to be enemies. Preston Waverly had spent 40 years proving one approach. Nia and Malcolm Carter were spending their careers proving another. And Atlanta, watching it all unfold in real time through videos and lawsuits and press conferences and settlement agreements, was learning which approach actually built something worth having. The sun set over the city, casting long shadows across buildings and streets and lives all interconnected in ways people rarely stop to consider. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments where choices would define character. But tonight, in their respective spaces, Naya and Malcolm rested in the knowledge that they'd made the choices that let them sleep peacefully. Preston, alone in his mansion surrounded by the wreckage of his empire, was just beginning to understand what those choices cost when you got them wrong. 6 months after the settlement, Atlanta had largely moved on to newer scandals and fresher outrage. But the reverberations of that November night at the Azure Hotel continued to reshape lives in ways both visible and hidden. The Waverly Tower, now officially rebranded as Stellar Holdings headquarters, stood as a daily reminder that empires built on cruelty eventually crumbled under their own weight. Preston's name had been scrubbed from every surface, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale told in business schools and legal seminars about what happened when unchecked power finally met accountability. The Carter Foundation for Civil Rights Litigation had moved into a renovated space in Midtown Atlanta, 3 floors of offices bustling with attorneys, investigators, and support staff working cases that ranged from individual workplace discrimination to systematic challenges against corporate hiring practices. Evelyn Marsh sat in her corner office reviewing intake forms from potential clients, her experience identifying patterns of discrimination now deployed in service of justice rather than complicity. She'd testified in 2 cases already, her meticulous documentation providing the kind of evidence that turned allegations into certainties. Defense attorneys had tried to discredit her as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the recordings and emails and internal memos spoke for themselves. Evelyn had watched Preston operate for 8 years, and she'd learned exactly what evidence prosecutors needed to prove that discrimination wasn't accidental. It was policy. "Evelyn, we have a walk-in," her assistant said from the doorway. Woman named Claire Rodriguez says she worked at Meridian Capital Bank and was terminated after reporting sexual harassment by a senior executive. Evelyn looked up from the intake forms. Did she bring documentation? Performance reviews, emails, witness statements. She's been fighting this alone for 18 months, burned through her savings on attorneys who kept telling her the case was too risky. Send her in. Claire Rodriguez was 36, wearing a professional suit that had seen better days, carrying an accordion folder stuffed with papers. She had the exhausted determination of someone who'd been fighting uphill for so long that they'd forgotten what level ground felt like. When she sat down across from Evelyn, her hands trembled slightly as she organized her documents. "I've been following your foundation since it launched," Claire said. "I kept hoping I wouldn't need help, that I could win on my own. But they just filed another motion to dismiss, and my attorney says we're running out of options." Evelyn took the documents and began reviewing them with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen this pattern countless times. "Tell me what happened." Claire's story was grimly familiar. Excellent performance reviews until the moment she reported her supervisor's inappropriate advances. Then suddenly she was difficult to work with, and not a team player, and showing declining productivity in evaluations that contradicted years of documented success. Within 3 months of her complaint to HR, she'd been terminated for performance issues that materialized only after she'd become inconvenient. "They're claiming I was fired for legitimate business reasons," Claire said, her voice tight with frustration. "But I have emails showing my supervisor praising my work a week before I reported him. I have witness statements from colleagues who saw him corner me in the break room. I have everything except unlimited money to fight a bank that can drag this out forever." "You don't need unlimited money," Evelyn said quietly. "You need the right strategy and the right team. That's what this foundation provides." She pulled up the case management system on her computer. "We're going to assign you a senior litigator who specializes in retaliation cases. We're going to conduct a full investigation, including interviews with current and former Meridian employees to establish a pattern. And we're going to use discovery to force them to produce every email, every performance review, and every internal communication related to your termination." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I can't afford—" "The foundation covers all costs. That's the entire point. Preston Waverly's settlement money is now funding cases exactly like yours. You'll get the same quality of representation he had, except we're fighting for justice instead of immunity." "Why?" Claire asked, and the word carried the weight of 18 months of fighting alone. Why would you help me? Evelyn thought about Preston's office, about years of watching casual cruelty disguised as business decisions, about the moment she'd decided that silence was no longer an option. Because I spent too long being part of the problem. This is my chance to be part of the solution. And because Nia Carter proved that standing up to powerful people works, now we're making sure everyone has that opportunity, not just the ones who get assaulted on camera. After Claire left with an intake packet and her first strategy meeting scheduled, Evelyn sat alone in her office feeling the strange satisfaction of watching the system actually work. Not perfectly. It would never be perfect as long as victims had to fight for basic dignity. But better. Incrementally, measurably better than it had been 7 months ago when Preston Waverly thought he could push a woman into a pool without consequences. Across town at Morrison and Chase, Nia was in a deposition for a case the foundation was supporting, a class-action lawsuit against a tech company accused of systematic pay discrimination against women. She'd transitioned from being a client to being one of the foundation's most active board members and volunteer attorneys, using her expertise and her platform to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. Mrs. Carter, isn't it true that your involvement in this case is motivated by personal vendetta rather than legal merit? The defense attorney asked, trying to rattle her. Nia looked at him with the calm she'd perfected in years of courtroom battles. My involvement is motivated by the fact that your client pays women an average of 18% less than men for identical work. That's not a vendetta. That's documented discrimination that violates federal law. But your high profile from the Waverly case proved that discrimination has consequences. This case is proving that those consequences extend beyond individual incidents to systematic practices. If my profile helps shine light on your client's illegal behavior, I consider that a benefit rather than a liability. The defense attorney tried a few more angles, but Nia had been trained by some of the best litigators in the country and had been hardened by her own experience fighting Preston. She didn't rattle. She didn't deflect. She simply presented facts with such clarity that denial became impossible. After the deposition, Martin Chase walked her back to the conference room where they could speak privately. You've become quite the advocate. The foundation has changed you. The foundation gave me purpose for what happened, Nia corrected. Preston assaulted me, and that was horrible. But using that experience to help others fight back, that makes it mean something beyond just personal trauma. How many cases are you personally involved in now? 7 active cases, another 12 in development. Plus, I'm consulting on the policy work Jennifer's doing with the EEOC to strengthen discrimination protections. Nia smiled slightly. Turns out getting pushed into a pool on camera creates opportunities to change systems. I'm using every one of them. And how are you doing? Really doing, not the public version. Nia considered the question honestly. Some days are hard. I still get angry when I see the video, which people send me constantly, sometimes supportively, sometimes to harass me. I still have moments where I feel like I'm being defined by the worst thing that ever happened to me instead of everything I've accomplished. But then I meet someone like the woman who came to the foundation last week, single mother who was fired for taking maternity leave, lost her health insurance, almost lost her apartment. We took her case, fought her employer, got her a settlement that let her rebuild her life. That makes the hard days worth it. Martin nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd spent 50 years in these trenches. Justice work is never just about the individual case. It's about the signal it sends. Every time we win, we tell victims that fighting back is possible, and we tell perpetrators that immunity isn't guaranteed. You've become a very powerful signal, Nia. I just want to make sure the signal leads to actual change, not just publicity. It is. The EEOC reported a 43% increase in discrimination complaints filed in the 6 months since your case went public. That's not just publicity. That's people finding courage they didn't have before. That's your legacy. Legacy. The word followed Nia as she left Morrison and Chase and drove across Atlanta to the foundation's office for a board meeting. She'd never sought to be a symbol or a voice for a movement. She'd just refused to accept being assaulted without consequences. But somewhere between the pool and the settlement and the foundation launch, she'd become both, a living reminder that dignity wasn't negotiable and that power could be challenged successfully. The board meeting focused on the foundation's growth and sustainability. They'd helped 63 clients in 6 months, won settlements in 12 cases, and had another 45 in active litigation. The success rate was remarkable, but it came with challenges. Legal costs were substantial, demand was overwhelming, and the $12 million from Preston's settlement, while significant, wouldn't last forever if they didn't develop additional funding sources. We need to think about long-term sustainability, Jennifer Morrison said, pulling up financial projections. At our current rate, we'll burn through the settlement funds in approximately 4 years. We need grants, donations, maybe an annual fundraising gala to keep this viable. A gala, Nia said with dark humor. That worked out well last time. The room fell silent for a moment before Evelyn spoke up. Actually, that's not a terrible idea. Not the same kind of event, obviously, but a fundraiser that brings together companies that want to demonstrate commitment to civil rights. Make it about celebrating progress and funding future work. Call it the Accountability Gala and make corporate sponsorship the price of admission. The idea took shape quickly. Companies that wanted to show they were serious about diversity and inclusion could sponsor tables. Law firms could send their civil rights teams. Business leaders who understood that ethical practices were good for long-term success could network while supporting meaningful work. It would generate funding, raise awareness, and create an annual reminder that the work wasn't finished. I like it, Martin said. Make it clear this isn't charity. It's investment in accountability. Companies that sponsor are making a public commitment to civil rights. That creates both financial support and reputational incentive to live up to their stated values. They scheduled the first accountability gala for the following spring, giving them 6 months to organize, secure sponsors, and ensure it would be nothing like the Nexus Foundation event that had started everything. This wouldn't be about wealthy people congratulating themselves on their own magnificence. It would be about actually supporting the work of justice with resources that made that work sustainable. As the meeting ended and board members filtered out, Malcolm arrived to pick up Nia. He'd been at his own board meeting discussing Carter Technologies' expansion plans. The company had grown substantially in the 6 months since walking away from the Waverly deal, adding staff, opening a second office, and securing partnerships with 3 Fortune 500 companies. "How was your meeting?" Nia asked as they walked to the car. "Productive. We're launching a new AI ethics initiative, making sure our technology gets used for good rather than just profit." Malcolm smiled. "Turns out publicly standing up for principles makes other companies want to work with you." "Who knew?" "Everyone who's not Preston Waverly knew," Nia said, squeezing his hand. "How's he doing, by the way? Have you heard anything?" Malcolm shook his head. "Radio silence. His lawyers keep him isolated from the business world. Occasionally someone spots him at a restaurant or a store, but he's basically disappeared from public life." What Malcolm didn't know, what almost nobody knew except Preston's therapist and the handful of people still in contact with him, was that Preston Waverly had spent the past 6 months engaged in the most difficult work of his life. Not business rebuilding or reputation management, but genuine self-examination that required confronting every ugly belief he'd spent 60 years nurturing. Therapy twice a week with Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in helping people unlearn prejudice and rebuild their understanding of themselves and others. Reading assignments that made him squirm, books by Black authors about systemic racism, memoirs by women who'd faced workplace discrimination, academic papers on unconscious bias and structural inequality. Volunteer work at a community center in a neighborhood he'd never bothered to visit when he'd been powerful, serving meals and tutoring kids and learning what life looked like for people he'd spent his career marginalizing. It was humbling and humiliating and absolutely necessary. Preston had lost his empire, his reputation, his social standing. The question was whether he'd also lost the prejudices that had made him push Nia Carter into that pool. Whether he could become someone different, or whether the best he could hope for was becoming someone who knew how wrong he'd been. "Tell me about the worst thing you've ever done," Dr. Chen said during one session, though they both knew the answer. "I assaulted Nia Carter at a charity gala because she was successful and Black and refused to accept my racism," Preston said. He'd practiced saying it plainly, without euphemism or justification, because that was part of the work. "I pushed her into a pool in front of hundreds of people because I thought my wealth and connections made me untouchable." "And what do you understand now that you didn't understand then?" Preston was quiet for a long moment. "That power isn't protection. that hurting people doesn't make you strong, that being white and wealthy gave me advantages I pretended were merit, and when I saw someone succeed without those advantages, it threatened my entire worldview, so I attacked her. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she proved I wasn't as special as I'd convinced myself I was. That's significant insight. How does it feel to acknowledge that? Like dying, Preston admitted. Like watching everything I believed about myself get dismantled piece by piece. Like realizing I wasted 60 years being the villain in other people's stories. What comes after the dismantling? Dr. Chen asked gently. I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe I'm too old to become someone different. Maybe the best I can do is acknowledge the damage and try not to cause more. Or maybe, Dr. Chen suggested, you could consider that change is always possible if you're willing to do the work. You've lost the external markers of success, the company, the reputation, the social standing. What if that loss created space for something more meaningful? Not redemption exactly, because some things can't be redeemed, but growth, evolution, becoming someone who uses whatever time and resources remain to make amends. Preston thought about that as he left therapy and drove through Atlanta streets that felt both familiar and foreign. He'd built monuments in this city. He'd shaped skylines and influenced policy and made himself essential to how business got done. And it had all been built on a foundation of bias and cruelty that eventually collapsed under its own weight. What came next? He genuinely didn't know. But slowly, incrementally, he was starting to understand that not knowing might be better than the false certainty he'd lived with before. Not knowing meant he had to listen instead of assume, had to learn instead of lecture, had to recognize that the people he'd spent his life dismissing might know things he desperately needed to understand. It was a start, a small, uncertain start. But it was something. 10 months after the assault, the first annual accountability gala took place in a completely different venue with a completely different purpose than the Nexus Foundation event. The Carter Foundation had rented a ballroom at the Atlanta History Center, deliberately choosing a space that grounded the evening in context. This city's complicated history with civil rights, the progress that had been made, and the work still remaining. 15 companies had purchased sponsorship tables at $50,000 each. Another 100 tickets had sold to attorneys, activists, and business leaders who wanted to support the work. The evening included presentations from clients the foundation had helped, performances by local artists, and a keynote speech from Nia that distilled everything she'd learned in the past year. I didn't choose to become a symbol, Nia said, standing at the podium where a year earlier she'd announced the lawsuit against Preston. I just refused to accept being assaulted without fighting back. But in fighting back, I learned something important. Individual justice is important, but systematic change is essential. One lawsuit held one man accountable. This foundation is working to hold an entire system accountable. She talked about the 63 cases they'd supported, the 12 settlements they'd won, the 45 fights still ongoing. She talked about Claire Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson and Elizabeth Chen and all the other people who'd found courage to stand up because someone else had stood up first. She talked about how justice was contagious when people saw it was actually achievable. Preston Waverly thought he could push me into a pool and walk away because that's what powerful men had always done, Nia said, her voice steady but passionate. He was wrong. Not because I'm special, but because enough people were finally ready to say that behavior was unacceptable. The phones that recorded that assault weren't just capturing one moment. They were documenting a turning point. The moment when boys will be boys, and that's just how business works, stopped being acceptable excuses. The audience applauded, but Nia wasn't finished. We're here tonight to celebrate progress, but also to recognize how much work remains. Discrimination didn't end when Preston resigned. Harassment didn't stop when we won our settlement. The systems that protected him for 40 years are still protecting others. Our job, the work this foundation exists to do, is dismantling those systems one case at a time, one victory at a time, one moment of accountability at a time. Malcolm watched from his table with fierce pride, understanding that his wife had transformed trauma into purpose with the kind of alchemy that changed movements. The woman who'd been pushed into a pool was now pushing back against an entire structure of injustice, and she was winning. After the keynote, during the networking portion of the evening, Evelyn Marsh approached Nia with a woman in her early 40s. Nia, I want you to meet someone. This is Sandra Waverly, Preston's daughter. Nia's professional composure flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. She extended her hand cautiously. Sandra, I didn't expect to see you here. Sandra shook her hand firmly. I bought a ticket because I wanted to support the work you're doing, and because I wanted to apologize in person for my father's actions. You're not responsible for what he did. No, but I'm responsible for how I respond to it. I spent too many years making excuses for him, telling myself he didn't really mean the things he said. Watching what he did to you was the wake-up call I needed to stop being complicit in his hate. Sandra's voice was steady, but carried deep emotion. I'm a corporate attorney in San Francisco. Employment law. I've spent the past year reviewing my firm's practices, pushing for better discrimination protections, calling out bias when I see it. Your courage inspired me to finally use my position to make things better instead of just surviving in the system. That's meaningful work, Nia said sincerely. It's the work I should have been doing all along. I grew up watching my father hurt people and telling myself it wasn't my problem. I'm done with that. I'm done with silence. Sandra paused. He's trying, My father. Real therapy. Genuine self-examination. I don't know if he'll ever become a good person, but at least he's finally trying to understand why he was such a bad one. Nia absorbed that information, feeling complicated emotions she didn't try to simplify. I hope he succeeds. Not for his sake, but because the world doesn't need more Preston Waverleys. Agreed. And for what it's worth, the foundation you've built is extraordinary. You took the worst thing he ever did and turned it into something that's helping hundreds of people. That's not just justice. That's transformation. After Sandra moved on to speak with other foundation supporters, Malcolm appeared at Nia's side. That looked intense. Preston's daughter, apologizing for him, supporting the foundation, doing her own work to challenge discrimination in her sphere. Nia shook her head with wonder. The ripples just keep spreading. That's how change happens. You stood up, which gave Evelyn permission to speak up, which gave 63 clients courage to fight back, which inspired Sandra to challenge her own complicity. Preston thought pushing you into a pool would put you in your place. Instead, it triggered a cascade of accountability he never imagined. The gala raised over $1 million, securing the foundation's work for years to come. More importantly, it created a community of people committed to the ongoing work of challenging discrimination wherever they found it. Attorneys sharing strategies, activists connecting with resources, business leaders committing to better practices. All of it flowing from one woman's refusal to accept being assaulted without consequences. A year after the assault, on the anniversary of that November night, Nia and Malcolm returned to the Azure Hotel. Not for a gala this time, but for a private moment of reflection. They rode the elevator to the rooftop where it had all happened and stood near the infinity pool that now held a small plaque the hotel had installed. The plaque read, "In recognition of Nia Carter's courage in confronting injustice and in commitment to ensuring all guests are treated with dignity and respect, November 2025. They wanted to name the pool after you, Malcolm said. The hotel ownership. I told them you'd decline. Good instinct. I don't need monuments. I need the work to continue. Nia looked out over Atlanta, the city lights spreading like stars across the darkening landscape. You know what's strange? I'm grateful it happened. Malcolm looked at her in surprise. Grateful to be assaulted? Grateful for what came after. The foundation, the cases we've won, the people we've helped. If Preston hadn't pushed me into this pool, none of that exists. He meant to humiliate me, but he actually gave me purpose. She turned to face her husband. I wouldn't choose to go through it again, but I also wouldn't undo it, because that would undo everything we've built from the wreckage. They stood together as the night deepened, two people who'd taken the worst moment of their lives and transformed it into a movement for justice. The pool reflected the city lights, beautiful and calm, holding no trace of the violence that had occurred there or the transformation that violence had triggered. Somewhere in Atlanta, Preston Waverly sat in his therapist's office working through the damage he'd spent 60 years creating. Somewhere else, Claire Rodriguez was preparing for a settlement negotiation that would vindicate her fight against retaliation. Across the country, Sandra Waverly was presenting new anti-discrimination policies to her firm's partners. In dozens of courtrooms and offices and boardrooms, people who'd been pushed around were pushing back, finding courage in Nia's example. The work wasn't finished. It would never be completely finished as long as power could be abused and people could be marginalized. But it was happening, progressing, improving. One case, one victory, one moment of accountability at a time. Nia Carter had been pushed into an infinity pool by a man who thought his wealth made him untouchable. She'd emerged from that water determined to prove that dignity couldn't be drowned, that justice was achievable, and that consequences eventually caught up to everyone regardless of how much money they had or how many connections they'd built. She'd proven all of that, and more. And in doing so, she'd changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless people who'd been waiting for someone to show them that fighting back was possible. The infinity pool stretched toward the Atlanta skyline, and for the first time since that terrible November night, it felt like what it was meant to be. Not a site of trauma, but a reminder that some people, when pushed, don't just survive. They transform their pain into power, their humiliation into purpose, and their worst moment into the catalyst that changes everything. Nia and Malcolm left the rooftop hand in hand, walking away from the pool and toward whatever came next, knowing that the foundation they'd built would outlast them both. That was legacy. Not buildings with your name on them or monuments to ego, but systems that made the world more just, more accountable, more humane. Preston Waverly had built an empire. Nia Carter had built something better, a future where empires like his couldn't survive unchallenged. And in the end, that made all the difference.